morning, all. It's nice to see all the faces here to start our Ryterband Brunch program again this year. For those who don't know, my name is Rick Goldberg. I wear several hats here at Temple Israel. One of them is the Brotherhood President, which actually is an inherited title from my uncle and my dad. So,
hereditary brother.
Yeah. So the next couple of weeks, next week we're going to have a Zoom speaker, Rabbi Sally Presan, who was the first female rabbi ordained by HUC. So that'll be interesting. The following 2 weeks actually, we're going to go over to Beth Abraham. And on the 20th of November, where's Bob at? Bob, there's Bob. So we're going to go hear Bob talk about the Jewish life in 19th century America. And then on the 4th of December, we're going to listen to Elliot Ratson. So what we're doing this year new is that we're recording our brunches as long as we get authorization from the speaker. And David may have to tone down his comments knowing that they're going to be recorded. We'll see. We'll see if he tones anything down, because actually I don't think he's going to. So they will be put up at a later time on our YouTube channel for other people to look at. So without further ado, I want to introduce Rabbi David Sofian. You know him, you love him. Here he is. David, thanks for being here.
I figure that Bob is talking about his subject because he remembers the 19th century. Let me tell you what I feel like. I feel like a zoo animal that's been on loan for a while and has returned, and everybody came to see how well it did. As I look around and I recognize almost every face, which I'm not sure exactly what that means, except that it's a good thing that you're all still around and I'm still around to recognize your face. All right, so here's what I want to do. There's an actual subject that I picked for this when Carol contacted me in the dark ages, like 6 months ago, whether I would be willing to do this. I don't remember when you sent me the email, Carol, but it was a long time ago. And then, of course, there were the Israeli elections last week, and I suspect that several of you are curious to talk about that. And so I promise you we will get to it, but first we're going to talk about what I intended to talk about, okay? And so I had no idea how many people were going to come. I think that we're going to have to share these. Not everybody always wants them anyway. I always hand out things so that you can take them home with you, and when people say, "What did he talk about?" and you can't remember. This actually, someone told me they were at my last class a little more than a week ago and was asked by the person's spouse, asked, "What did he talk about?" and he said, "I can't remember." So,
but it was very good.
that person was Aaron, in case you missed it. And if you will share these. So you may be wondering why there's handwriting on it, because when I copied it, what was there was in light pink, and it didn't come through on my copier because I didn't have it set for color, so I wrote it in. There are 3 or 4 places where that's the case, where you'll find pink. It's not that I was making things up, it was just easier than doing the whole thing over again, because I love dealing with technology. I'm sorry, I only made 30 copies because I had trouble believing there would be more than 30. If somebody will give Rabbi Bodney Alice a copy, she could make more copies, because that is in her job description. Sally Presan, who finished school just as I began. She graduated in 1972. She was the first woman ordained by Hebrew College, first woman rabbi in the United States. Has a very interesting story to tell about her journey, which I'm sure she'll be telling you about next week. If I were you, I would tune in. It's definitely worthwhile. Okay, so what I want to talk a little bit about,
Excuse me, David, they have to come here to see her.
they have to come here.
They have to come here to see her, it's gonna be on this screen.
It's gonna be on this screen and only on this screen. And if you don't come, it'll be your loss. Just be sure that you come with your $7 and then sit down at the table. Okay, so the question that I wanted to talk about was a different way maybe of thinking about Jewish identity. How does Jewish identity work? And there's a specific problem with Jewish identity that I want to try to get at, which is it's obvious that Jews throughout the world, just in North America, do not have uniform ideas that make them Jews. So the question is, how can we live in a community that is not uniform, but is still united? That is still unified? Isn't that really the problem? How in America can we be different kinds of Jews and at the same time be connected to each other as Jews? That's a very, very difficult kind of problem. And this particular thinker, his name is Avraham Infeld. If you're curious who Avraham Infeld was, if you look on page 2 of 3, in the second paragraph, I think it tells you, Avraham Infeld had a long and meaningful career. It was easier for me to copy an article that someone wrote about him than something that he wrote. So that's what I did. He had many accomplishments. He is the president emeritus of Hillel. He also is a founder of Taglit Birthright Israel, director general of the Shalom Hartman Institute, and the first specialist in informal Jewish education to be awarded the Hebrew University of Jerusalem's Samuel Rothberg Prize for Jewish Education in 2005. So this was a guy who knew what he was doing. We're not talking about somebody without experience in either the Israeli Jewish community or the North American Jewish community. This was somebody who thought about this a lot. If you're in Hillel, Hillel is supposed to be one of those places, right? Not Hillel, the school in Dayton, but Hillel, the Jewish organizations on campuses and universities. It's supposed to be the kind of place, right, where all Jews can get together. Rarely does it turn out to be that kind of place. I don't know what your experience was, but my first experience with Hillel back in 1968 was that it was dominated by Orthodox Jews, and I went in one time and never went in again until I was a junior. And by then I was in relationship with a certain woman who got me to go there again. But you follow what I mean? This is a very long, old problem, long-standing, old problem. And this is the way he deals with it. And hopefully, by talking about this for a few minutes, we will then be able to slide into some of the realities of the Israeli election. Okay, you see this is in the handwriting part on the front page. He's about to pass them out. The wonders of the speedy copy machine. Rabbi Boddinghouse is speedy delivery. None of you remember that? Your children are all too old to remember that? Mr. Rogers? See, I still have a 3-year-old grandson, so. I'll read it out loud. Here's what it says. He says, a table with 5 legs is very sturdy. It is strong. I have seen tables meant for 5 legs stand on 4. I have seen them stand on 3. On 2, they tipple over. On 1, they are not even a table. So what am I? I am basically a Jewish carpenter. In other words, he wants to build Jewish life, Judaism, Jewish identity as a 5-legged table. The strongest kind of table. Right? 4 legs, 1 in the center, you can imagine. It is very, very stable. Very strong. If you take the one in the center out and you only have 4, Still pretty stable, right? Even if you turn it into a tripod and you only have three legs, still pretty stable. But what happens if you only have a two-legged table? Is it really a table? More like a lean-to. And if it's only one leg, it never even had a chance of being a table. It's not stable, it's not sturdy, it won't stand. Okay, so that's what he's trying to do, and he wants to delineate what the 5 legs are. What the 5 legs are. So if you again look on page 2 of 3. And I'm talking about the 4th paragraph down. We can sort of do this experiment. I'm not going to take the time to actually do it out loud, but you can do it in your own head. It's a thought experiment. To articulate this issue, what he says in the earlier paragraphs is simply since the emancipation and since Jews have been integrated into general society, particularly in the West, the issue of Jewish identity has grown as an ever bigger issue. It's one thing if you live in isolated shtetls or in isolated communities or ghettos, you don't have much of a problem with Jewish identity, right? Because the world has defined your Jewish identity for you, right? If you're in a ghetto and you can't get out, you may have a lot of things you want to discuss, a lot of issues, a lot of problems that bother you, that you want to deal with, but not Jewish identity. It's only when you're integrated, when the walls come down, when there's mixing between groups, which personally, all of you know, I think that's a good thing. But when you have that, the unintended consequence is you have the issues of Jewish identity. What makes us Jewish? Okay, so he says, to articulate the issue, Infeld drew from an intriguing experience of his speaking to Jewish college students all over the world. He challenged them, he talked to them about the table, and he said to them, first, I'm going to give you an analogy. If I say orange, apple, orange, banana, and then I say cucumber, lettuce, broccoli, and then I say Jew, blank, blank, what do you put in to the blanks? So, apple, orange, and banana, right? All fruits. Cucumber, lettuce, broccoli, all vegetables. But what if you say Jew, blank, blank? What goes in there? You see, that's how he was getting at the question of your identity. It reveals what you think about Jewish identity depending on what you put into the blanks. So he said most of the students filled in Jew, blank, blank with Jew, Christian, Muslim. How many of you would have done that? You sure? You would be defining Judaism, Jewish identity, as a religion. We're all comfortable with that? No. The correct answer is no. But an Israeli might answer this, Jew, Arab, American. What's the difference? Or you might say Jew, Arab, Italian, or Jew, Arab, Australian. It doesn't matter. How is the Israeli defining Jewish identity? As a kind of nationality. All right? And then Russian Jews, we had a lot of opportunity to deal with. More than 1 million Russian Jews came into Israel in the 1990s. I say that glibly, but think about it for a moment. In the 1990s, I don't know, there were between 6 and 7 million Israelis total, and they absorbed 1 million Russians. Imagine what would that be in the United States in a decade? Absorbing 66 million immigrants. Just think who would go insane in this country if we tried to do that.
The Mexicans.
Okay,
So a lot
but
of people come
Israel happily absorbed 1 million Russians who did not speak Hebrew, who lived in a cold climate, not in the Middle East in a desert, who had no idea what life in Israel would be like. People got off the plane and then had to figure out what to do. I guess a popular profession among Jews in the Soviet Union was mining engineer. You know how many mines there are in Israel? I'm talking about the kind you dig into the ground, not the kind that float in water or that you step on. How many mines are there in Israel? Answer, 0. Okay? All of those Russians who came, who said they were engineers, that Israel said, you're really technicians. And all of them that came as doctors and nurses and pharmacists all had to repass, by Israeli standards, qualification exams. Imagine what this was like. Israel happily made this happen, not without difficulty, huge difficulty. It was very, very difficult. Very, very difficult. Okay, how did Russians answer the question? They're not really born Israelis the same way as natives were. So how did Russians answer the question? Jewish blank, Jew blank blank. They answered Jew, Russian, and then varying third answers. In other words, for them, they thought they were an ethnicity. All right, so what are we? A religion, a nationality, an ethnicity. We could go on from there. Those are the three he had. We could take a vote. Obviously, religion would seem to win among this group. But maybe not after you've thought about it for a minute or two. Are we only a religion?
I think you just, by adding only, I think you, at least in my way, my way of thinking, made it a more reasonable question. Because I probably would have answered Jew, Christian, Muslim, but I don't think that Judaism is only a religion. And when you, there's more to it than that. And I think your only is extremely important.
Right. Okay. It's a game. And Reed is used to my games. So she knows to be on guard. whenever I set these things up. But in this case, it wasn't my game. It was Infeld's game. Okay. So what he's going to suggest, I think, is sort of an interesting idea. He's going to suggest that a table with 5 legs in which each leg is a kind of Jewish identity is really what we're after. So he sees 5 sources of Jewish identity, and he wants to argue that if you have all 5, you have the strongest Jewish identity, like the strongest faith. If you have 4, you have a strong Jewish identity, and you're still a table. If you have 3, you have a Jewish identity, and you're still a table. But if you only have 2, there's a big question mark about your Jewish identity. And if you only have 1, you really don't have a Jewish identity. I think that that's what he's going for, right? So then the question is, what did he delineate the legs? What did he think that the legs were? So I should have marked this in advance, but I didn't. If you look down to the last full paragraph on page 2, the second to the last paragraph, it starts with the first leg. Does everybody see that? Okay. Of the 5-legged table, he thinks that the first leg is memory. Now please note, he doesn't say history. What's the difference between memory and history? So if you take a history course, in theory, you are going to learn history, right? You're going to learn historical facts. Is it fair to assume that everybody in this room still believes there is such a thing as facts? Can't take that as an assumption anymore. What? Okay, so what we now know about history is nobody writes objective history. But that does not mean, in my opinion, that any one reconstruction of history is as good as any other. Right? There are better opinions than others, depending on what information, what facts, what pieces they're putting together to form their opinion. Okay? But all that is different than memory. How many people here have been to a Passover Seder? The Passover Seder purports to be teaching, to be telling, right? It's called the Haggadah. What does Haggadah mean?
Order.
No. Seder means order. So you guys are in the ballpark. Haggadah means telling. It is the present participial noun form of the Hebrew verb lahagid, which is to tell. It is the telling or the story. But, right, when you sit down and you read the Haggadah, which purports, it talks as if everything is a historical fact, but in fact, what is it? It is the telling of historical memory. In the book of Exodus, who is a main character apart from God and Pharaoh? Who is the real main character? Moses. Where is he in the Haggadah? How can that be? If this is history. It's not history. It's memory. We're relating the way we remember something. Okay? And so he understands Jewish identity to be about Jewish memory, relating the way we tell a story, the way we tell our own story, the way we understand ourselves within the story. I think this is hugely important. I usually use a different metaphor, which is what kind of glasses do we have on, right? So we can take Genesis 2, that's the story of the Garden of Eden, and if we're wearing Jewish glasses, we read that story and we tell it in a certain way. If we're wearing Christian glasses, we read that story and we tell it in an entirely different way. Same story, same exact words. So is the story Jewish or Christian? And the answer is yes. Depending on who's telling the story. If I'm telling the story, it's a Jewish story. If my friend Jack Kepke, who was rector of St. Paul's in Oakwood, he tells the story, it's a Christian story. So memory is very, very important. The question you might want to be asking yourselves is, how strong is your Jewish memory? What are your Jewish memories? So I picked the obvious one, right? Everybody seems to have Passover Seder memories. Good, bad, or indifferent. It may contain simply matzo ball soup. It may contain the whole Seder, but we all have those memories. Do we have Shabbat memories? Do we have high holiday memories? Do we have Sukkot memories? Let's be honest, ladies and gentlemen. How strong are our memories? A big component of Jewish identity. Second, he continued explaining the next leg. That understanding, that feeling, that warmth, that sympathy, that empathy, and with an understanding that we are, a family. That's why we are called Bnei Israel, not Jews. Now, in Hebrew, you can call yourself Jews. Yehudim is Jews, which really means Judeans, of the tribe of Judah. But if you look in the prayer book, more frequently than not, we call ourselves what? Bnei Israel. What is this congregation? What was it? Bnei Yeshurun. Yeshurun is another word for Yisrael. It means the upright or the honest ones. Why do we call ourselves Bnei Yisrael? The children of Israel. So this is a little more difficult in an open society, particularly in an open society where we have lots and lots of mixed families. And when we have lots and lots of families where somebody in the family is Jewish but was not born Jewish. How strong is our sense of being part of the same family? Now in Israel, this is very easy, frankly. If you grow up in Israel, in Jewish Israel, the chances are you take it for granted that you are part of a Jewish family. It's just who you are. In America, North America, I would argue, in Europe, any place in the West, it's pretty hard to take for granted that we are part of a Jewish family. Particularly if we didn't grow up in one, or if we grew up in one and only had one or two legs as part of its table. right? Do we all see that? Am I making you all look like you're stupefied or something? I know Mitchell's half asleep, but everybody else should be awake. Right? So are we part of the family? Number one, what's the content of our Jewish memory? Number two, are we part of a Jewish family? Number three, very interesting. Third is Mount Sinai. You can interpret Sinai however you want, but you cannot ignore it. This is religious Judaism. Mount Sinai is what? Mount Sinai is where we receive the Aseret HaDibrot, the Ten Commandments, right? This is the beginning where we receive the Torah. This is all about Jewish religious life, however you define it. Reform, conservative, Orthodox, Reconstructionist, renewal. Are there any more R's that have popped up in the last 7 years? What? I said R's. Joel, you're not listening again. Humanistic, right? All these kinds of things, right? There's all these different ways, although the humanists specifically don't want to claim that they're religious, so scratch what Joel just said. Which is Jewish religion has to deal, Jewish identity has to deal with Mount Sinai. I would have argued, if I had been writing this, that Mount Sinai has to be at the center of the Jewish story of memory. Remember, this is just the way we tell the story. You know, you're familiar with the kind of little joke about the man who goes into a bar, he's Jewish, he sits down next to a woman at the bar, turns out he's Jewish, and he starts talking to her like he knows her. You know this, right? And she says to him, "Who are you?" And he says, "Well, we must have met at Sinai." Because according to Jewish tradition, what? We were all at Sinai. We were all at Sinai. I see that as an essential component to the story. He breaks it out as a separate kind of thing, meaning you have to be involved in Jewish religious identity. Okay, so what do we have so far? Memory, family, religion. Okay, what's 4? 4a and 4b. You can sort of see coming together. The fourth leg is the land of Israel and the state of Israel. Now, those are really two different things. Those of you who've been to Israel, how many people have been to Israel? Okay, so when you're touring on your standard, I used to say the standard 2-week tour, and the 2-week tour got to be too expensive. So it became the standard 10-day tour, which got to be too expensive. And now it's the standard 7-day tour. I don't know what you're doing 12 days. Well, no one ever said that Karen Botany Alice was standard. Good for you. But whether you did the northern loop, that's usually what you do. My understanding is this group is doing the southern loop, which is really fascinating and really interesting. If I can put in a pitch for this, if you have been to Israel many times and you've never done the southern loop, this is definitely worth doing. It's a whole different experience entirely than the northern loop. But on those trips, what is the guide toggling back and forth between? Usually 3 things, actually. She's talking about the land of Israel, the topography, the rivers, the mountains, the valleys, the deserts, the swamps, the seas, right? And the state of Israel. Like often when you're in Tel Aviv, you go to Independence Hall, right? You might go to the Ayalon Institute. Is that on your... I won't tell you what it is in case there's somebody here who doesn't know what it is. It's really a fascinating little place that's about 10 minutes from where I live. Or you go to the Palmach Museum or something like that, which is all about the state of Israel, the founding of the state, what has happened with the history of the state. I've never spoken with a company. It's okay, Becky. I used to have one of those little xylophones.
It's a cute ring.
And Linwood once brought one of those animals to Shabbat morning services. And you don't have to take my word for it, I'm sure Rita was there and a couple other people were there. He started playing the Mika Mocha along with me, and I had to figure out how to communicate to him that that was not a good idea for the future. Those of you who remember Linwood. Yes, on that I was successful. Anyway, okay, but also the third toggle is usually Jewish religion. You know, like the Western Wall, or this is where this kind of thing is reputed to have happened, all that kind of stuff. And by the way, if you're in a Christian group, the guide is also toggling between different things. So when a Christian group goes up north, it spends a lot of time in the Galilee, in places that Jewish groups never go, like the Sermon on the Mount took place on, or the Mount of the Beatitudes, or all these various places where there are little churches. And what is the story? What is the guy talking about? Christian religion and the land of Israel, and then sometimes the state of Israel, depending on the kind of Christian. Right? So you can see why he thinks this is the fourth leg. What do we think? Obviously, this is very important to me. What do we think about the land of Israel and the state of Israel as part of our Jewish identity? Not as a political discussion, as part of our Jewish identity. The reason I'm kind of belaboring this point, apart from it being important to me, is if we're going to talk about Israelis' elections next, and if you're like me, who is somebody profoundly disappointed in what happened in the Israeli election, Joel thought that I had a heart attack and was going to be in Miami Valley Hospital on Wednesday morning. Shows you that he doesn't know everything. It's not about me. But that should not be influencing part of a Jewish identity that is tied to the land of Israel and the state of Israel. Right? You may be unhappy with the way certain events are going. Think about this in American terms. If things do not go the way you think they should go on Tuesday, how many of you are planning to move to Canada? How many of you are planning to disengage in American life in a total way? Peggy, anybody else? I guess you're going to be on your own here. No, if American identity is American identity, is our identity, right? We may not like the way things go, but it doesn't mean that we disconnect from it. That's what he's trying to say about the land of Israel and the state of Israel. If it's part of your Jewish identity, it means that you may have to deal with it in a different way if you do not like the way things are going, or if they are difficult, but it doesn't mean that you disconnect from it, or perhaps never connect to it in the first place.
But isn't there a reason to establish the state of Israel? And you could have made the same argument without the state of Israel?
Not this particular lake.
Right, but is it really, he thinks it's a requirement, but if Israel was never founded, and it would have been an act, if it was never founded,
So I understand your point. What I have a difficulty with your point is, he never said these are requirements.
Right.
What he said is that these are pillars, legs that strengthen Jewish identity. And to talk about strengthening Jewish identity now and not talk about the land of Israel and the state of Israel is, to put it mildly, not even blinders, a blindfold on. Right? It's not to be looking at all. And so that's what he's trying to say. He's not trying to say that these are absolute requirements as a point of fact. He said none of them are requirements. You still have a strong Jewish identity with 4 legs, and you still have a Jewish identity with 3 legs. Okay, so what is the 5th and the last leg? Again, one very important to me and very problematic in the United States, in North America. The 5th leg is the Hebrew language. The purpose of language is to pass a culture to future generations. An example Infeld provided was the Hebrew word tzedakah. So who would like to translate, as it's pronounced in modern Hebrew, tzedakah, or more Yiddishization, tzedakah. Who would like to translate that for me? Yes.
Righteousness.
Oh, well, you already know the game. How is it ordinarily translated? Charity. In point of fact, in Hebrew, there is no word for charity. Almost certain of that. Sarah might know better. Do you know a word?
Donation or something.
There's a word for donation, absolutely. There's a word for good-hearted, kindness, all sorts of other words. But the English word charity, which I think comes from the Greek. I think it comes from the Greek, that doesn't exist in Hebrew. Tzedakah means righteousness. And there is a very big difference between thinking of charity as something that comes from the goodness of your heart, that is purely voluntary, and thinking of donations as tzedakah, something that you're obligated to as a result of your Jewishness, of your Jewish identity, and that of course it does good things, but that it's not simply motivated out of the goodness of your heart. Those are, I'm sure you've all heard that sermon. Somebody has to have given it here on Rosh Hashanah or Yom Kippur at least 100 times. And in every synagogue, it doesn't matter what the synagogue is, right? So there's a very, very big difference. And what he is saying is Jewish identity is carried in the Hebrew language. I would go much further than that, because a language affects your thinking and it affects the way you encounter the world. We tend to think that because we speak native English and the world has chosen to turn English into the lingua franca and you can find English everywhere, that everyone looks at the world the way we do. That's a kind of American hubris. Actually, an Anglo hubris, because the Brits have it also. Okay. But if you look at something from a Hebrew point of view, it's very, very different. I was talking with a friend who is American. She's married to an Israeli. They both lived in the United States for a while they were in school, and so his English is quite good, but it seemed as if we were not communicating something really well. And my friend said to me, that's because my husband has a Hebrew mind, and we're talking to him from an English mind. And it's very, very easy to disconnect. Okay, Hebrew is clearly a big part of Israeli identity. Infeld is arguing it should be a big part of Jewish identity. I will close with this thought with one other thought. Somebody once asked me, I haven't published a lot of things in my career, but I actually wrote this up and it was published in the CCR Journal a few years ago. Why did I insist when I was working with people towards conversion, some of you who are in the room here who may remember this, that you learn to read Hebrew? I was really insistent upon it. Spent hours and hours with lots of people learning to simply decode Hebrew, to recognize an aleph from a bet, from a gimel, and all the vowels and how to put them together. Why did I insist upon that? Was it just kind of busy work so I could test and see how serious you were about really becoming Jewish? I suppose someone could draw that conclusion. It really wasn't my motivation. My motivation was my understanding, and I believe this is the truth, that even at the beginner level of simply learning to decode Hebrew, when you can do that, it strengthens your Jewish identity. When you can sit in synagogue and not simply say the Shema by rote, because you've memorized it and you've heard it 1,000 times, but can see it in the prayer book and actually read it and enunciate it as you read it, somehow that makes you feel more Jewish. I see a couple people nodding their heads who were with me, but that was the theory. The theory was that Hebrew is part of Jewish identity. So then what are the 5 legs of the table? Memory, right? The second one was family. What was the third one? Religion? Yeah, of course. That would be the one the rabbi would forget. The third one would be religion. The fourth one is the state of Israel and the land of Israel. And the fifth one is Hebrew. Now, his point is, if you have any 3 of them, you have a real Jewish identity, and you will have at least one in common with every other Jew. Obviously, if you have all 5, you'll have more than one in common with every other Jew. But if you have at least three, remember he was interested in how do we take a people that is not uniform and make them more unified, more united. He wants to find the common point. If everybody has three legs at least for their Jewish identity, everybody will have at least one leg in common with every other Jew. So there will be something that binds us all together. It'll be different depending on which Jew you're talking to, but there always is a connector.
I want to go back to Hebrew. Are we really talking Hebrew or are we talking a common language? Doesn't Yiddish serve the same purpose
No,
as Hebrew
why not?
amongst those who came from the European,
Yeah, that's
the
correct.
European Jewry experience?
That's correct. It did do that. She said, what's wrong with Yiddish? Why didn't you pick Ladino or Judeo-Persian or Judeo-Arabic or any of the other Judeo languages? There's only one that's in common to them.
But they're common Jewish
There's
language.
only one that's common Jewish language to all Jews. That's Hebrew. Those of us who came from Eastern Europe, or have family from Eastern Europe, we tend to think, Yiddish should be the language, except it really isn't, and we all know that. It's been gone for my grandmother already stopped speaking Yiddish to my parents, who didn't know any Yiddish to speak it to me. I know the difference between Grace and Kleina, because I was the Grace and my brother was the Kleina. Right? And when my grandmother said, when my grandmother said to my grandfather, Luz, which meant leave them alone, we understood that too. Okay, you now know all my Yiddish.
David? Right here.
Surprise. Oh, okay.
Well, I find the Jew blank blank and the five-legged table interesting concepts, a little bit disjointed, but I would like to know how you were going to fill in Jew blank blank.
I would,
Then it's a trick.
it would have to be Jew blank, 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 blank.
Okay, so please wait until I come with the microphone. I'm not as fast as Rabbi Karen, but I will get there.
I was just gonna say that I think that Hebrew is the unifying language simply because it's a language that you can go anywhere in the world. And you look at the prayer book or whatever, you're with Jewish people and it is Hebrew, it's not anything else.
Yeah, you can go to Morocco, you aren't going to hear any Yiddish. Okay, so out of this identity, if you buy into the analogy at all, I would be encouraging you to ask yourself, what are my three legs? Am I interested in either leg 4 or leg 5? And then use this as a means of finding the commonality with another Jew. Right? So it may be, in my case, like with certain Israeli Jews, what we have in common is the state of Israel in Hebrew. Right? But because they really haven't bought into the Sinai thing at all, they don't quite get the American Jewish community as part of the family. And maybe they tell the story, maybe they don't, in terms of Jewish identity. You follow what I'm getting at, but you can always find something. You can find some commonality that helps us feel and be connected. Okay, one more time I'm going to ask if anybody has a comment or a question, and then we will go to what many of you really are here for, to talk about the election.
So this be extrapolated to US politics, to find, this is what your thought, or is it different?
Of course it can be extrapolated to US politics. That's not my subject though. No, but I believe that in the United States, we are also struggling to find where the common points are. The problem here, and by the way, this can also happen in Israel, is there, in my view, there are way too many people here. This is one of those controversial things that we'll see when people look at the recording, whether they decide this is the point they want to turn it off, which is, there are too many people who don't want to look for common points. They don't care about common points anymore. They are convinced that they are right, and therefore everyone else is wrong. I wish it stopped there. They are convinced that they are just, and everyone else is evil. And because of that, it's become very, very difficult to have any connection, any common points across disagreements. It's what makes me the most pessimistic about American life. And frankly, there are equivalents in Israeli life, and it is those equivalents that also make me pessimistic about Israeli life. At the point that we no longer can find any legs in common, and essentially we're now two different tables. That happened once before in American history. Became the Civil War. Yeah.
I think one unifying point here in the United States was other people point you out as a Jew, however you define yourself, and that is a unifying thing. You are Jewish versus whatever else the world wants you to be.
So it's a very interesting thing because Carol, you didn't say this straight out, but I'm going to put a word in your mouth. I'm sure you'll correct me if I'm wrong. You notice none of the 5 legs were anti-Semitism. Where most people would say that we may live in an open society, we may be mixed in an open society, but because of the reality of anti-Semitism, in essence, you can't escape your Jewish identity. So if nothing else, you have a negative Jewish identity. You know you're Jewish because everyone else says you're not them. Okay, I think that that's real. But he's interested in how do you build a positive Jewish identity, as opposed to merely how you build a negative identity, because I can't be X, Y, or Z, therefore I have to be Jewish. By the way, that's who the Russians were. When the Russians came in the 90s, the first group of them came in the 70s, and it was already clear in the 70s. There were Fuseniks who came in the 70s, and then in the 90s, after the fall of the Soviet Union and things opened up, then they came. Most of them knew nothing about being Jewish. You saw that here, I'm sure, in the ones that came to date. There was no sense of Jewish story. There was no sense of being connected to Jews in any real way, except their identity card said Jew on it, and they knew that they were discriminated because their identity card said they were Jew. So all they had was negative Jewish identity, which also made it harder for them in the state of Israel, and it made it harder for them here. It's why so few of them, again, clearly labeled controversial statement, why so few of them actually had anything to do with the Jewish community once they got here. They were happy to accept our help. Grateful as hell. They were happy to accept our help. But be involved in the synagogue, send your kids to religious school, get involved in Jewish life? No thanks. That was true in Israel too. And that's because they didn't have any experience of it. It all had to be created from scratch.
I just had one concern, and I do buy into the table and all the different legs. My concern is for the next generation, for the younger people who are exposed to maybe 1 or 2 legs of the table, and then their experience is, okay, now I can choose between these 2, maybe I'll just choose one, and then how do you get to the table, get more people to the table?
Well, it's, you're exactly right. It's what all of us are concerned about. And so, you notice one of the things that he helped create was Birthright Israel, in which the theory was, if we make it free, we will send hundreds of thousands of Jewish kids to Israel so that they can begin to adopt that as one of their ways. And that is what happened. My problem with Birthright Israel is it's a very curated 10 days. All intended to try to control the experience to the point that it produces a guaranteed outcome, which often is, turns out you get the opposite, because it is so curated. But at least he took steps to try to do something about this. It's figuring it out for the next generation is very, very difficult. I don't think there's anything new here. That's what religious schools are about. That's what day schools are about. That's what youth groups are about, right? That's what youth trips to Israel, when family trips to Israel, bar mitzvah trips, all these kinds of things are to establish, look, is it better to have a family who affiliates for the 3 years that they need to affiliate so that they can have their kid bar mitzvah, and then the kid is bar mitzvah, and then they disaffiliate, or for them never to have affiliated? All right, so every rabbi I know hates the first option, but prefers it to the second option. Right, so what's old is new.
Yes, I'm scratching my head a little bit in terms of this analogizing about the vegetables and then the fruits and then the Jew blank, blank, blank. No, I've heard of Jew being a religion, and then other people call it an ethno-religion. But when people say nationality, that's where I'm scratching my head. I've never heard anybody say Judaism is a nationality like being an Italian or an American or something like that. So
Are you familiar
that's why I'm
with,
having a difficult time here.
are you familiar with the Second World War? Serious. What was the claim about Jews in the Second World War? What did the Nazis say about Jews?
About 2, 3, 4 generations. We have one.
That they're a nationality that has to be wiped out. It's a vermin nationality, but a nationality. Unfortunately, lots of people think this. I agree with you, I don't think this. But there are plenty of people that do. And so all he was going for in the analogies is what are the common points? This should be fascinating.
Actually, I do like the analogy of a table, so I'm not going to argue with you too much. I would just suggest that we add a sixth leg to the table, and that's being a light to the nations. Because I think right now, in these dark times, we need to step up and be a light to the nations.
I have no argument with that. I think Infeld would have said that that's under Mount Sinai. He specifically says that actually at the end of the sentence. But it doesn't matter what his point is, what are the common things that hold us together? Okay, let's talk about what happened on November 1st. Okay, so on November 1st was the 5th Israeli election in under 4 years. How you used to say about Ohio, if you don't like the weather, wait a day or two and it'll be different. It's sort of like, you don't like the way the election goes in Israel, wait a few months, there'll be another. Okay, I don't think so this time. Last time I was hopeful that the last government, when I was standing here a little more than a year ago, it was October 2021. Somebody asked me how long I thought the new government would last, and I said I was hopeful it would be 2 years, but that if they passed the budget for sure would last a year. Turns out I was right about the B part, not the A part. Meaning they did pass the budget and it lasted a year, but through relentless pressure from Netanyahu and his cohorts, they were able to peel away 2 votes. Remember, they only had 61 seats in the Knesset. They were able to pull away 2 votes, which was not all that hard when you consider the only thing that those parties in the previous government had in common was that they wanted to keep Netanyahu out. Otherwise, they had nothing in common with each other. And they did last for a year. In my opinion, they accomplished several significant things, which is not the subject today for us to talk about, but they did. But ultimately, at least two legislators were pulled away, and so the government fell, and new elections were called again. Did anything change in these elections? A lot changed in terms of the outcome. But in terms of the electorate, someone was asking me before, I'm compulsively early, so I was here early. I believe the person I was talking to forgot to set his clock back, and so didn't know that daylight savings has. So the two of us were here early, and so we were talking about Israeli politics. Asked me if something had really radically changed in the electorate. And my answer to that is no. There were about the same number of votes that were voted for center-left parties as were voted for center-right parties. I don't know whether you actually saw that or heard that or not. The impression you would get from American media is that Netanyahu's group won in something like a landslide. Well, all right, he got 64 mandates out of 120 with his whole right-wing coalition. So it's 64 to 56. That is not exactly a landslide. But the same number of votes, more or less, were cast on each side of the center divide. So what happened that was so different? This is where you have to give Netanyahu credit. It sort of sticks in my throat, but you have to give him credit. Okay, so first of all, everybody gives credit to Netanyahu as being this political genius. He was such a political genius, which translates to mean he was willing to lie to everyone all of the time, that in the last election, the reason he was ousted is nobody would make a deal with him anymore because nobody believed him. And so therefore, this odd platypus of a government that was made up entirely right-wing and left-wing, center, Arabs, all put together to keep Netanyahu out, was only able to do that. Why? Because they all hated him. He had lied to every one of them somewhere along the line in a significant way. The most recent was Benny Gantz when he refused to allow the rotation to happen and he let the government fall because they didn't pass a budget. Some of you will remember all that. But okay. So I don't know that he's a brilliant tactician. But what he was able to do was to count. And he understood something about basic arithmetic and Israeli elections. In Israel, there were 40, if I'm remembering right, 49 parties that ran for the Knesset. I'm sure that was not a fact that was reported very widely. There always are all of these ridiculous little parties, the parties that want to legalize marijuana, the parties that want, I don't know, to require everybody to wear tzitzit that are at least 6 inches long. All these ridiculous kinds of parties that I made that exist, and obviously they don't all get in the Knesset, nor should they get in the Knesset. How do they stay out of the Knesset? Israel has a threshold that you have to get a certain number of votes, which equates to 4 seats, or you're not in. 4 seats is 3.25% of the electorate. We together so far?
How many seats is that?
4. 3.25 seats. 3.25%, 4 seats. So, one of the problems is, if you don't get to 3.25%, you do not get into the Knesset, and all of the votes of the people that voted for you are wasted. Did we all see that? So it sounds like a perfectly reasonable idea that you have to have at least 3.25%, or otherwise the Knesset will be overrun with a multitude of meaningless parties, and it will make coalition building virtually impossible, and we won't be able to govern, right? That all seems to make sense. You end up with the phenomenon of a great potential for wasted votes. Okay. Netanyahu understood that. As I said, he can count. So he pushed together Otzma Yehudi, which means Jewish power, which should tell you everything you need to know about that party. It is the grandchild of Kach, which was a fascist, racist party in the 1970s that was outlawed. He pushed that party, led by a guy named Itamar Ben-Gvir, together with something that's called the Religious Zionist Party, which is run by Bezalel Smotrich. Don't you love that name? Smotrich. Who came Kishno. It is exactly as his name sounds. Who is of the religious Zionists, which mostly means the settlers. These are not natural bedfellows. The fascist right and the settlers are not exactly the same thing, although Smotrich and Ben-Gvir say things that are very, very similar to each other and very dangerous. Netanyahu pushed them to run together as a single entity in the election. You see that? So to guarantee that one of them was not below the 3.25% and have wasted votes. Moving to my left. On the left side, there are also 2 parties like that. obviously of entirely different ideological stripe. One is called Meretz, which is the most left-wing socialist kind of party in Israel's history. It has been part of the Knesset, I think every Knesset for the last 45, if not 65 years, a very, very long period. And the other is Labor. Once glorious Labor, that's Ben-Gurion's original party. It wasn't called Labor in his time, it was called Mapai in his time. But Labor, which is the grandchild of Ben-Gurion's party, which has been going downhill like a snowball on Mount Hermon for the last 20 years. And there was fear that the same thing would happen, and Lapid, who is the current prime minister, center-left, tried to push them to run together. But the problem is that we have Jews with egos. Netanyahu was able to make that happen. For a while, it looked like it wasn't going to happen on the right because of those egos. But on the left, the labor leader, whose name is Michaeli, Yael Michaeli, she refused to run together with Meretz. Her belief was that running separately, they might each get 5 or 6 mandates. Running jointly, they might have 7 or 8. And that she was willing to run the risk. And she refused to make the deal with Meretz. Meretz did not make it into the Knesset. Nearly 180,000 votes were wasted. Now, in the Arab world, just so you think, shouldn't go away thinking this is only a Jewish problem. There are 4 parties in the Arab world. And they used to run together. Indeed, when they ran together, they got the most seats that they have ever gotten. In the last election, one of them broke off, which you heard about. It's called Ram, which is actually an Islamic religious party, but it joined the previous government, which was what gave it its majority. Its leader is Mansour Abbas, who said it's about time that we actually get some power and get into the government so that I can actually do something for my constituency. What a thought. And this time, another party broke off from the other 3. Balad, who is kind of a nationalist, communist kind of Arab party, secular party, it refused to join with the other 2. And so it too did not make it into the Knesset. Which means where Netanyahu put together his danger parties, and not only did they make it into the Knesset, they grew to be the 3rd largest party in the Knesset. 15 seats, if I remember right. Were together before they had something like 11 or 12. They grew. Whereas Meretz did not make it in, Balad did not make it in, the 2 of them together produced 290,000 wasted votes. Meretz did not get 3 1/4. The last thing I read, 3.25, it got 3.19. 0.08 of a point. Now, you still with me? So that's problem number 1. Problem number 2 is what seems to make sense about forcing these parties to join together so that they can cross the threshold can be counterproductive. Because what it means is if I'm a right of center party, but I need an extreme right of center party to be part of me so that I make it into the Knesset, I make a deal with the extreme right of center party, which gets them into the Knesset where they would not have gotten in on their own. Moreover, if you have political discourse and you have ordinary people and you have zealots all sitting in the same room, who has the most influence? The zealots. And so, what I would call the crazies tended to influence the Israeli right into the Israeli extreme right. That's the second thing that has happened in this election because they gained so much power. Ben Gvir will be a minister. Smotrich will be a minister. The ministries that they want, if they were to get them, like the Ministry of the Interior, or the Ministry of Education, or the Justice Ministry, could do more in a year to destroy Israeli democracy than it takes to build it up over a generation.
What will they do?
What might they do? They want to make Supreme Court justices directly political appointments. They want to change the system. They want to change the system so that there's more direct control of the majority in the Knesset. In other words, pure majoritarianism becomes totalitarianism. Then they're fine with it. Smotrich, he wants all of the laws of Israel to be Torah laws. From an Orthodox point of view, an extreme Orthodox point of view. He wants to codify the law, both of them, both have said this, and actually so has Netanyahu, because he's being pulled towards them. You know, there's a big debate in Israel about whether the ultra-Orthodox should be drafted. I guarantee you that debate's over until this government falls. Okay, so there's plenty that could go wrong. Meanwhile, on the other side, something else that happens in Israel, you have to, you know, you talk about Israel, it's people saying, what is it like to vote in Israel? Well, you go into the booth after you've checked in. You go into the booth, and on a table is a bunch of little slips of paper, each one with the party symbol on it. You pick up the one that you're voting for, you put it in the envelope, seal the envelope, walk out, put it in the box. That's voting. Sounds so simple. Somebody said to me, why can't we have that system here? Okay, so there's the problem with the 3.25%. But what if, somebody do the math, if 3.25% makes 4 mandates, so what is that? Like 0.8% is a mandate? Does that sound about right? It's a little, that's not exactly right. That would be 3.2, but you get something like that. Well, what if you have a total of 3.4? What happens to those extra votes? Right? You don't have enough to get to a 5th mandate. So you're in and you have 4, but what happens with those extra votes? Yeah, unless you have a vote sharing agreement with another party. So what they do is they understand this problem, so they make agreements with each other, left and right, that if I have extra votes, so imagine if there were some extra votes in labor. I don't know that there were, but I'm betting there were, since what is the likelihood that labor got exactly 3.25 votes?
So who supervises the sharing?
It's all done by agreements in advance.
And those are registered?
Yeah, it's all done in advance between parties, and it's all registered, it's all above board, there's nothing secret about it. But what if labor's extra votes could have gone to merits, which would have gotten merits up to 3.25 from 3.19. But the 2 of them couldn't even make that agreement because they're Jews. They were so convinced of their own rightness and anyway. So you put this all together, and because all this matters. If merits makes it into the Knesset and they have 4 seats, that changes the total numbers, which changes how many Likud has, how many everybody else has, and probably would have brought Netanyahu down. Those 4 could have brought him to 60. And he wouldn't have won. What if Balad had made it into the Knesset? They weren't even close. I think they were 1.9. But what if they had made it into the Knesset? It could have changed it again, so that we ended up with the same kind of stalemate that we had with the previous 4. The difference was not that the Israeli electorate had changed so much, so many more right-wing voters. What had happened is many right-wing voters became more extreme, strengthening a more extreme form of right-wing politicians. But there was nearly an equal number of votes on both sides, but the left had played it so badly that they virtually guaranteed their loss before Tuesday. That's what's happening.
Has there been any discussion about ranked choice voting?
How would you do ranked choice voting?
So instead of.
You don't have candidates.
it would be parties, it would have to go to whatever party, but they
Yeah,
have to
you-
agree on that also.
Yeah, I can't imagine that ever happening. There's no candidates, you just vote for a party.
Right.
So it's not like you can rank a bunch of candidates. You can't say, my first vote goes to Likud, my second vote goes to Otzma Yisrael. You can't do that because it would diminish the whole notion of just voting for a party. And believe me, whenever Israel tries to make an adjustment, like Israel went for the direct election of the prime minister, thinking that was the problem, that turned out to be a fiasco when they did that in the 90s. And now there are people who are saying we should use the American system and like make half the Knesset representative of districts in, and have actual candidates running against each other. My guess is they would find a way to make that into a disaster too.
I thought I read somewhere where some of the ultra right-wing people want to remove Arabs from Israel.
Well, remember this guy, his name was Kahana?
Yeah.
Does that ring a bell with anybody? Mayor Kahana? He was so extreme, he was an American. Of course, all the great ideas in Israel come from America. Brooklynite, right. My favorite place. But he emigrates to the state of Israel and he starts advocating for the transfer of Arabs, for the purification of the state of Israel as a Jewish state, blah, 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 blah. And he's ultimately outlawed. He's not allowed to run for the Knesset. One of his admirers was a guy named Baruch Goldstein. Remember him on Purim morning in 1994, where he murdered several Arabs at the cave of the Machpelah in Hebron? There was a young man named Itamar Ben-Gvir, who was a major supporter of Kahana. Remember I just mentioned his name, right? He was a major supporter of Kahana, so much so that he had Baruch Goldstein's picture up in his living room. And before Rabin was assassinated, he was arrested for stealing the Mercedes-Benz symbol off of Rabin's car and holding it up to the Israeli media and saying in Hebrew, I'll say it in English, "We've got your car, you're next." The Israeli army would not draft him because he was too extreme. Imagine that. The Israeli army said, to paraphrase Uncle Sam, "We don't want you." He's never served in the Israeli army. He lives in Hebron, carries a pistol with him at all times, regularly draws it to show to people whenever something is happening that he doesn't like, because he always puts himself in every hot spot, in every bad situation. He's going to be a minister in the next government. That's what I said, he's a Kahanist, he's a fascist. Let's just call it what it is. So that's what happens when an election that is really evenly divided in terms of the votes is not played out evenly in terms of the results of the votes, in terms of the way things get played out according to the rules, according to the law, with the radicalization of the right, Netanyahu desperate to do anything to get back into power, and so you end up with these people in the next Israeli government, which we should be hearing about in a matter of a few days.
So when do you think the next election is going to be?
Tomorrow would be fine with me. I actually think this will be relatively stable for at least a year, maybe 2 years. I keep saying that every fall. The reason I think that is Netanyahu will be vulnerable. Remember, Netanyahu's right wing, but he's not Itamar Ben-Gvir. He's not Bezalel Smotrich, but he's going to be pulled in their direction all the time, and they're going to be threatening him to bring down his government every time he does or doesn't do something that they want done or don't want done. Okay? And like there was already an example of this. One of the people in that radical party is radically opposed to LGBT. And Netanyahu already shut that person down because this person wanted to outlaw the gay parade in Jerusalem. And Netanyahu said, we're not doing that. But eventually, he'll be pulled and he'll be pulled. And there'll be the possibility of one or two of these people peeling off. And sooner or later, the government will fall that way. I mean, it could last the whole 4 years of the term. But I'm guessing it won't fall right away because these people are going to love having the power that they have. You know, you get all sorts of perks when you're a minister, there's all sorts of pluses to this, and they're going to love that. Certainly the ultra-Orthodox parties aren't going to disappear. They've been in the wilderness for a whole year. They have their own agenda of always more money for the yeshiva, less control of the basic curriculum, all the kinds of stuff that should be happening, won't be happening. So it's not going to fall right away, but these fissures will surface and then they'll get deeper and it'll take a while, just like it does with every government.
You used to say, when you started this several years ago, that Israelis voted more on local issues, the economy, et cetera, that people couldn't afford housing, et cetera. Is that not an issue anymore?
No, that's still true. They did the same. Whoever is in power ends up holding the bag for what's ever going on. So the cost of living in Israel, the cost of living in Ohio does not compare with the cost of living in Israel. You know, we like to compare, but you know what I was paying for gas? $10 a gallon 6 months ago. Now everybody in Europe pays 7 or 8. Americans are just silly spoiled in terms of the way this works. If gas goes up 10 cents, you would think that the earth opened up and swallowed us all. But the rest of the world actually pays significantly more. We were in Rome in June. They were paying $8 a gallon there in Rome. It's because it's all based on taxes. It's all based upon what you need to do to keep the society running. But the cost of living is very, very high in Israel.
So that didn't influence the current election?
It did, because it caused some people to blame the current government. You know, always we want somebody else if we're not happy with whatever is going on. It doesn't matter that most of the problems didn't happen in the last year. They happened in Netanyahu's 12-year reign beforehand. But Lapid was blamed for lots of those kinds of local things. And I'm sure that contributed to the Likud victory. But it was also this kind of sense of insecurity. That's a local issue. When people feel insecure, meaning their money is not going as far, there are incidents, there's been a huge, it's actually down a little now. There was a huge increase in the number of murders in Arab cities by Arab gangs against each other. And also then it spilled over into the mixed cities. And so when people feel insecure, and when people feel that there's inflation, and when people don't feel really very happy with the way things are, who do they blame? Whoever is currently in power. So there was some of that also, no doubt.
Yes, I have a question. The Biden administration said that there would be problems, I think, if Kabir is made a minister or a cabinet member. So what do you think is going to happen?
Yeah, Biden says a lot of things. Unfortunately, I mean, if Ben-Gvir becomes a cabinet minister, which I consider personally to be a disaster, it's all a result of the democratic process in the state of Israel. There was nothing nefarious about this. Nobody, you know, there was no vote tampering or no, you know, none of that kind of stuff, which is for sure what would be said here. No doubt. And so the Biden administration will probably be selective about who it deals with, but it will continue to deal with the state of Israel. And Ben-Gvir is not about to become the defense minister. He's not about to become the foreign minister. So it's unlikely that there's going to be an interaction there. I'm much more worried about the danger. What if he becomes the minister of the police, which is what he says he wants? What if he becomes the minister of the police in terms of what goes on in the West Bank? What goes on in the mixed cities? What goes on in Jerusalem? With him at the top of that structure. It's plenty scary as it is without having to bring the American administration.
What about Netanyahu's criminal?
You mean, what about his trial?
Yeah.
All right, so two things can happen. One, all of his new friends in power will find a way to put an end to it. They'll pass a law that changes the rules of the game mid-game, and he will be no longer in jeopardy. That's certainly a distinct possibility. Another possibility is they'll put it on hold while he's prime minister. A third possibility is it'll just play itself out, but it takes years. When Ehud Olmert was put on trial for corruption about things that he did when he was mayor of Jerusalem, he was prime minister. It took 7 years before he was convicted. So,
United States.
yeah, it's no different here, it's true. And so, one of those three things could happen. What would really be scary and anti-democratic is if they find a way to get him out of jeopardy. And his allies have already said that they're ready to do that. And they'll have a majority. So it's possible. It's possible. So, all right, we've been doing this for a long time. Let me close with a certain thing. It's certainly possible, and this is why I wanted to start the way I did and why I tried to structure things the way I did. It's certainly possible to get very, very discouraged if you care about the state of Israel, if you live in the United States and you're watching this. I can't imagine that anybody who even remotely thinks along the same lines that I do isn't discouraged by this election. It's another thing altogether to say, or to throw up your hands and say, I don't want to have anything to do with this. And that's what I'm afraid of. What I'm afraid of is with this government and some of the things that it may do, it will not be difficult for American Jewry, certainly center and left of center American Jewry, to simply throw their hands up and say, I don't want to have anything to do with that. If we do that, and if the center left and Israel does that, I can guarantee you what the future will be there. Because if we're going to leave the playing field to the other side, then we know what the results are going to be. This election, if we care about those five legs, and one of them is the land of Israel and the state of Israel, and a third one is Hebrew, if we care about those kinds of things, we can't leave the playing field to them. We have to redouble our efforts. All of you should belong to ARTSA if you don't already, Association of Reformed Zionists of America. You should belong because ARTSA represents your kind of thinking in Israeli life. If you want to support the Israel Religious Action Center, which is like the American Religious Action Center in Washington, D.C., in Jerusalem, that also is representing our interests. If you want to support the Israel Movement for Progressive Judaism, the IMPJ, there's all this alphabet soup that you can learn, then that represents our people on the ground trying to make a change in Israel. My congregation in Israel, Yozma, significantly works in our little city of Modi to change the attitude. We live in a very pluralistic city with a very open kind of attitude, and we do everything that we can to encourage that on a local level. And believe me, local level matters, just like it matters here. There's lots of ways that you can engage in the state of Israel in a way that furthers our values instead of simply saying, I'm not going to pay any attention anymore. This is too frustrating. We're losing. I don't like what's happening. I'm disengaging. So my hope is you will not do that, and nothing I said today will cause you to do that, but only encourage you to be more involved.
Rabbi, it looks like you didn't mention anything in foreign affairs. I get the impression that Israel is more secure now. And also, what is the future of the Abraham Accord?
I don't know the answer to that, but I'll make a guess. Okay? The Abraham Accords were gigantic in terms of normalizing relations with these Arab countries, the United Arab Emirates and the like, and with Morocco. This is gigantic, and I'm hopeful that it's not going to dissipate based upon what this government might do. Okay, if this government, for example, decides to effectively annex the West Bank, they won't call it that, they'll call it normalized. But if they decide to do that, I don't know what that will do to these relationships with these other Arab countries. I don't know how that will work. But what I can say is that things look better than they have for a long time. because of the Abraham Accords, even with Turkey, they look better. Things are looking better with Turkey because Erdogan is interested in improving relations with Israel. If you look around right now, who is the big bad in the Middle East? Iran. Iran is the big bad. So that's why the UAE is interested in forming relationships with Israel. It's not like all of a sudden they got religion. It's like Israel is a big help, can really matter. And the same thing with Turkey. So if this government doesn't screw it up, it's a big capital I if. I believe that should continue.
Yes, I'm wondering, I've been reading that Israel is moving, the electorate is moving more to the right. And I'm wondering if this is negatively affecting the Ethiopian Jews.
You mean the ones that are already in Israel? The Ethiopian Jewish community that's in Israel is really an underclass, sadly to say. And it is, you might be able to see some signs that things are improving, but I'm not overly optimistic. I don't think that the movement to the right is a problem per se for the Ethiopian Jewish community that's there. It is a problem for future immigrants. But among other, unfortunately, Israelis are anything but colorblind. There is direct racial prejudice in the state of Israel, just like there is here. And the movement rightward towards a more tribal mentality does not help that, put it that way. What I think has happened is not so much that so many people have moved to the right, it's that the people on the right have moved further to the right.
Okay, last question.
Okay.
Do you see the situation in Israel causing, making a worsening of the problem on the American campuses, the BDS and other anti-Israeli movements there?
It's not gonna help matters. So if you're part of the BDS movement, and if Israel takes any of the steps that I was alluding to, you're going to see that as evidence that you are correct. And it is only going to encourage you and strengthen you. Now, the question is going to be, is the Jewish community, how is the Jewish community and the Jewish community's friends going to react to that? Okay. I chose to kind of sort of end my little soliloquy by starting with ourselves. How are we going to react to that? When the Israeli government does things that we just don't like but abhor, what are we going to do? Because if we aren't going to double down and engage stronger, how do we expect anybody else? Kids on college campuses or allies in the non-Jewish world, how are we going to expect any of them to double down for us? We have to start with ourselves. And that's a big ask. I understand it's a big ask because we have plenty of tourists here. It's easy to just turn off that switch and not pay any attention. But if we do, we're leaving the playfield to people that we do not want to leave it to.
Let's give David a nice round of applause.